Most people covering this story are not going to tell you what I am about to tell you. Not because they don't know it, but because if you see these three events as one pattern rather than three separate incidents, the story becomes far more uncomfortable than any headline is willing to carry. You have heard the names: Butler, Palm Beach, the Iranian plot. Each one received its 72 hours of intense coverage, breaking news alerts, press conferences, breathless updates. Each one was then filed away as a discrete story: a lone gunman, a deranged man with a rifle, a foreign adversary doing what foreign adversaries do, and then we moved on. But here is the structural fact that the breaking news format cannot hold. 3 assassination attempts on a sitting American president in under 2 years is not a crime story. It is not a security failure story. It is not even a politics story. It is a civilizational signal. The Roman Republic, one of the most sophisticated, most durable political systems the ancient world ever produced, did not end with an invasion. It did not end with an economic collapse. It ended when political violence entered the form. When the act of killing a political opponent became, in the calculus of enough actors across enough factions, a legitimate instrument. Julius Caesar's assassination was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of decades in which the violence had been building. Historians who study the fall of republics will tell you, you can almost always date the beginning of the end to the first act of political violence that went without a full systemic reckoning. America has now had 3. The anchor number, and I want you to hold this, is 3. According to the Secret Service's own historical record, no American president has survived more than 1 confirmed attempt on their life within a single administration. Not Roosevelt, not Truman, not Reagan. 3 in under 24 months. That is where we are. But the count alone is not what makes this significant. What makes this significant is the variety. 1 domestic lone actor. No known network, no manifesto, 1 domestic ideological operative with international military connections, and a premeditated operational plan spanning months. 1 foreign state-sponsored apparatus targeting the same man from a completely different geopolitical angle. 3 completely different threat vectors. 3 different failure points in the system designed to prevent exactly this. By the end of this, you will understand those 3 attempts not as separate incidents, but as a single picture. A picture about the condition of the American state at this precise moment in history. July 13, 2024. Butler, Pennsylvania, a campaign rally. A 20-year-old named Thomas Matthew Crooks climbs to a rooftop less than 150 meters from the stage. He carries an AR-15-style rifle. He fires 8 rounds. 1 bullet grazes Trump's right ear. Corey Comparatore, 50 years old, a volunteer fire chief from Sarver, Pennsylvania, is killed as he shields his wife and daughters with his body. 2 other attendees are critically wounded. Secret Service agents kill Crooks 26 seconds after the first shot. Now here is the detail the coverage moved past far too quickly. Crooks was identified as suspicious by local law enforcement at least 30 minutes before the first shot. His presence was flagged. His location near the building was reported to Secret Service agents on the ground. And yet, he climbed the roof, settled into position, and fired. The bipartisan Senate investigation report released in October 2024 documented what it called, in the precise language of formal government inquiry, a series of security failures. The report found that agents on the ground had actionable information about Crooks, but lacked a functioning communication protocol to act on it in time. 1 system failure. 1 dead American. 1 presidency surviving by the margin of an ear. Now understand this. A single security failure, however grave, is a correctable problem. It is a gap you identify, analyze, and close. Every major protective apparatus in modern history has had gaps. The question is never whether a gap existed. The question is what the gap tells you about the system's condition, and what the gap reveals about what happens next. 6 weeks after Butler, something happened that changed the category of the problem entirely. Not because the second attempt was more dangerous, but because of what it revealed about the kind of person who had decided to try. The second attempt was not just a different man with a different weapon, it was a completely different logic. And when you understand the logic that drove Ryan Wesley Routh to that golf course fence and the note he left behind, you will realize this story was never about security at all. September 15, 2024. West Palm Beach, Florida, Trump International Golf Club. Ryan Wesley Routh, 58 years old, has been lying in the tree line along the golf course fence for approximately 12 hours, hidden, waiting. With him, an AK-47 style rifle, 2 loaded pistols, a scope, and a GoPro camera, apparently positioned to record what he was about to do, and a handwritten note. In that note, documented in the federal criminal complaint filed by the Department of Justice in September 2024, Ruth wrote that he was offering a $150,000 reward for someone else to finish what he could not. He was, by his own hand, commissioning the next actor, advertising an open contract, announcing to whoever found the note that the mission had not ended with him. Secret Service agents spotted a rifle barrel protruding from the fence before Routh could fire. He fled, arrested 4 miles away. Now, here's the structural difference from Butler that matters most. Crooks was, by all investigative accounts, a lone actor. No operational network, no international connections confirmed by investigators, no clear manifesto. His full motives remain to this day not publicly established. Ruth was different. Ruth had spent 18 months in Ukraine, by his own documented account, recruiting fighters for the Ukrainian military, meeting with foreign defense figures, building international connections across conflict zones. He was a networked actor, a man who had decided that political violence was not simply justified, but strategic. Strategic enough to film, strategic enough to incentivize, strategic enough to plan across months and then announce the continuation of the plan upon his arrest. That distinction is not a detail. It is the second layer of the pattern, because a lone actor is a tragedy. A networked ideological operative is a signal. A signal that the worldview, the specific conclusion that presidential assassination is a legitimate political instrument, is not contained to one disturbed individual. It circulates, it finds infrastructure, it waits for the next person who reaches the same conclusion. And then the third attempt arrived from a direction that nobody had fully anticipated. The third threat vector is the one that transforms this from a domestic security story into a geopolitical one. In 2025, the United States Department of Justice announced charges against Iranian nationals connected to an organized campaign targeting former and current American officials, including the president. The indictment described in prosecutorial language not a spontaneous act of hostility, but a coordinated operation with funding, with planning, with foreign state backing, a campaign. Stand back from all three now. A domestic lone actor with no established network. A domestic ideological operative with 18 months of international military exposure and an explicit succession plan. A foreign state-sponsored apparatus, 3 different ideologies, 3 different geographies, 3 different operational methods, 3 different failure points in the protective system, and the same target. That convergence is the most structurally alarming signal in this entire story, because multi-vector threats, simultaneous pressure from unconnected actors in different categories, are not random. They are the signature of a target who has crossed a threshold in the political imagination of multiple independent actors. A threshold that says, this is what legitimate political action looks like. You do not get that convergence from random distribution. You get it when something in the political atmosphere has shifted far enough that the conclusion, assassination as instrument, becomes thinkable across otherwise disconnected worldviews. The United States Secret Service operates under an annual budget that, according to the Congressional Research Service, as of fiscal year 2024, exceeded $3.4 billion. That's $3.4 billion in annual protective resources. And in 24 months, 3 actors from 3 separate threat categories reached operational readiness. Here is the counterintuitive statistic that most coverage has not connected to these events. The Varieties of Democracy Project, a research consortium at the University of Gothenburg tracking democratic health across 179 countries, published its 2024 dataset with a finding that deserves direct attention. The United States Liberal Democracy Index score has declined from 0.83 in 2016 to 0.67 as of the most recent dataset. That is a 19.3% decline in measured democratic health in under a decade. For context, a score below 0.5 places a country in the category of electoral autocracy. America is at 0.67. That is not a comfortable distance from a threshold that, once crossed historically, has almost never been crossed back. Now connect that number to the 3 attempts. The attempts are not the cause of that decline. They are the symptom. When a democratic system is functioning with genuine legitimacy, when citizens across the political spectrum accept the fundamental rules of the contest, political violence targeting the executive is a marginal, aberrant phenomenon. When the system's legitimacy fractures, the frequency of that violence is one of the first indicators to rise. What we are watching is the indicator rising. And here is what deepens the picture further. The United States is not generating this phenomenon in isolation. The Political Terror Scale, a dataset published annually by political scientists at the University of North Carolina, assessed in its 2024 report that political violence in Western democracies has increased by 31% since 2017. 31%. Across the entire category of stable Western democracies. America is not an outlier. It is the leading edge of a broader civilizational trend, and that changes the prescription entirely. If this were purely an American pathology, the solution would be American institutional reform, security protocols, better domestic counterterrorism, stronger political discourse. Those things matter. But if America is the leading edge of a broader breakdown in Western democratic legitimacy, then the correction required is something that no single administration, no single security reform, no single election cycle can deliver. It requires a reckoning with something older and deeper than any of the three perpetrators and older and deeper than any single presidency. Now, I want you to take a deep breath before the next part of this, because the question we have not yet asked, the question that places these three attempts inside a historical pattern that most people alive today have forgotten, is the one that determines whether this ends well or catastrophically. What does history tell us about societies that survive cycles of executive targeting? And what do the societies that survive have that the ones that collapse do not? The answer is not what you would expect. And it is not entirely comforting. Rome is the most studied case and the most misread. The assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC is so mythologized that people forget what the Roman Senate believed it was doing. They believed they were saving the Republic. They believed that removing one man, the most powerful man, would restore the system to its proper balance. What followed was 17 years of civil war, the destruction of the very republic the assassins believed they were defending, and the installation of Augustus, who was more powerful, more absolute, and more permanent than Caesar had ever been. The historical lesson that emerges from that sequence is counterintuitive and precise. Political violence targeting a leader does not weaken concentrated power. It almost always accelerates it, because every society that survives an assassination attempt, or three, demands a response from its institutions. And the response runs, with extraordinary historical consistency, in one direction: more executive authority, more security apparatus, more centralization. De Gaulle, France, 1962, 8 gunmen, 150 bullets fired at his motorcade at Petit Clamart. He survived. And what followed? The consolidation of the Fifth Republic's executive power at the direct expense of parliamentary pluralism. France survived, but it survived in a different shape, a shape that trades democratic breadth for executive stability. That is the pattern: survival through transformation. And the transformation runs consistently towards centralization. Before the next part, something deserves a full stop. Corey Comparatore was 50 years old. He spent his adult life volunteering as a fire chief in a small Pennsylvania town, the kind of civic life that holds communities together quietly, without recognition. He died shielding his daughters from gunfire at an event he attended as an ordinary American citizen. The two people wounded alongside him are navigating physical and psychological recoveries that the news cycle has largely moved past. The Iranian plot, had it reached operational execution, would have generated a body count and a political aftermath impossible to calculate cleanly. These are not abstractions. These are real people caught inside a pattern that extends far beyond any of them. Those lives sit behind every institutional calculation that follows. Now, the worst-case scenario. The Stimson Center, a nonpartisan national security research institution based in Washington, published a threat assessment in January 2025, identifying what their analysts termed the normalization cascade. The mechanism works precisely. Each attempt that occurs without a full systemic reckoning, meaning genuine public accountability, institutional reform, and cross-partisan consensus that executive targeting is categorically unacceptable, lowers the psychological threshold for the next actor. The first attempt is catastrophic. The second is alarming. The third, by the time the coverage cycle has processed it, has already been partially normalized by the very patterns of coverage that treated the first two as isolated events. Applied to current conditions, the Stimson Center's model assessed the probability of a fourth documented attempt in the following 24 months, absent meaningful structural change, at 40 to 60%, 40 to 60%. That number emerges from a model that tracks political violence frequency against institutional response quality, and the institutional response to the three attempts, measured against the standard of structural reform and genuine cross-partisan consensus, has been assessed as insufficient. The gap narrative here is worth naming directly. The official position, from the Secret Service, from the major parties, from most mainstream coverage, is that the system is functioning. Attempts are being detected. Perpetrators are being apprehended. No president has been killed, and that is factually accurate. But the observable reality is that three actors reached operational readiness, weapons acquired, positions taken, intent documented, before being stopped. The gap between the narrative of a functioning protective apparatus and the reality of three near misses in 24 months is not a communications problem. It is structural, and it has not yet been closed. Step back from the three perpetrators for a moment, because here is what all of this, the attempts, the historical pattern, the institutional gap, actually means for the question that matters most. What are the signals to watch, and what comes next? History gives us the map. The map says we have been here before. The only question still open is whether this generation reads it. What I want you to take from this is not alarm. Alarm is not useful. What is useful is the map. Because when you understand the historical pattern clearly, Not the American exceptionalism narrative, not the partisan narratives that weaponize every incident, but the actual record of what happened to societies that stood at this crossroads. You can see the shape of what comes next before the headlines name it. The societies that survive cycles of executive targeting without collapsing into autocracy share three characteristics. First, institutional credibility. Not perfect institutions. No society in history has had those, but institutions that retained enough legitimacy with enough of the population to absorb the shock of political violence without requiring a single leader to step into the vacuum and stabilize the system by force of personality. Second, a genuine cross-partisan consensus, stated plainly, not hedged, that political violence targeting the executive is categorically unacceptable as a political instrument. Not a partisan statement, not a tactical statement, a categorical one. Third, real accountability for the systemic failures that created the opening. Not just the prosecution of perpetrators, structural reform of the failures themselves. On all three measures, the American response to the three attempts has been, and this is the honest assessment, incomplete. Perpetrators have been prosecuted. The systemic accountability, the full public accounting of what failed at Butler, what the Routh surveillance failure reveals about protective protocols, and what the Iranian intelligence lapse means for the broader threat architecture, has not yet fully arrived. Now, the counter-argument deserves a genuine hearing. Serious analysts look at this data and arrive somewhere calmer. Their argument, the frequency of documented attempts may partly reflect improved detection and earlier interdiction, not a purely higher underlying threat. Better surveillance, better intelligence sharing, more sophisticated advance work. What looks like escalation may partly be visibility. Attempts that have always existed at some frequency becoming more systematically recorded. Former Secret Service Director Ronald Rowe made precisely this point in his Senate Homeland Security Committee testimony in September 2024. The threat environment has become more complex across the board, not uniquely targeted at one individual. That argument is not dishonest. It deserves respect. It is possible that some portion of the count reflects detection improvement, but here is what that counter-argument cannot resolve. Even if detection improvement accounts for part of the number, what does it tell us? About American political culture, about American rhetoric, about the American media architecture? That three independent actors across three completely different ideological and geographic contexts independently reached the same conclusion. That killing the president is a rational political strategy? Detection explains the count. It does not explain the intent, and the intent is the signal. Watch three things from this point forward. Watch the congressional response to the bipartisan security reform legislation introduced after Butler. The pace and comprehensiveness of that reform will tell you more about the genuine health of American institutions than any individual political statement from any official. Watch the Department of Justice's handling of the Iranian indictments, specifically whether those prosecutions produce a full public accounting of the intelligence failure or whether they are resolved in ways that minimize institutional embarrassment. And watch the political rhetoric across both parties regarding the legitimacy of the current administration. The language that political actors use to describe their opponents is not merely rhetorical. It calibrates the moral imagination of millions of people who consume it. The distance between rhetoric that describes political opponents as existential threats and the logic that drove crooks to that rooftop is shorter than any of us should be comfortable acknowledging. The honest picture, stripped of both the panic and the complacency, is this. America has not yet crossed the threshold from which historical societies have not returned. The institutions exist. The legal frameworks function. The constitutional architecture is intact. But 0.67 on the democracy index is not 0.83. 3 attempts in 2 years is not 0. The distance to the threshold is measurable, and it is not growing. History gives us the map. The map says we have been here before. The only question still open is whether this generation reads it.